Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Or a special word shout out to those of you in Amesbury. It was great to be with you last week, and I'll be back there again soon. And I hope you guys are having an awesome time of worship this morning. Last week we began talking about this whole issue of thanks. Of course, it's Thanksgiving week, and so we're kind of focused on that. And we talked a lot last week about how it is we give thanks and the kinds of things we are thankful for. And today I want to kind of follow up on that by talking a little bit about a spiritual component of Thanksgiving. And that is the Christian concept of stewardship. This word that we use in the Christian church quite a bit, this idea of stewardship. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, if it's a word you've grown up hearing or you've never heard it, but just to quickly explain, stewardship is essentially to care for the things that have been entrusted to you. And so we sometimes talk about being a good steward of the earth. You know, as human beings, the earth is ours, and we are to steward it. We are to care for it. Or we talk in the church about being good stewards of our resources and that kind of thing. To steward or stewardship means to take care of things that have been entrusted to us. The idea behind it really is kind of like, it's not actually ours. We don't own it. We don't own the earth. We're only stewards of it, caretakers of it while we're here. And so that idea of stewarding something, of caring for something. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about stewardship. And often in the church when we talk about stewardship, what we're really talking about is money. Talking about finances and how we care for and use well the resources that God has entrusted to us. The income that we have, the money that we have acquired or accumulated. And to be honest with you, for 28 years now, I've been talking about stewardship off and on over the course of the life of the church. And for some reason, it still often feels like of all the things we ever talk about, this is one of those areas that makes people uncomfortable. It's just something about this. It's something about that money thing that we still seem to struggle with talking about in the Christian church. Not just our church, but the Christian church in general, I think still struggles with this whole conversation around money. I mean, over the years, I have preached on things of a political nature. I've preached on controversial social issues. I've talked about addictions. I've even done sermons about sex. And yet, I don't think any of those have been as uncomfortable for people as when we talk about money. In fact, only once in my ministry, in 28 years, have I had someone get up and walk out on a sermon because of what was being discussed. And that was a sermon on stewardship. And so there is something about this that we struggle with, that we're kind of uncomfortable with. But I'd like to think that by now, we've been together a long time. I'd like to think by now that we could talk openly about these kinds of things, that we could just discuss it. We could just talk about it. And I mean, the reality is money is a part of life. It's a part of everything that we do. You can't separate yourself from it. And so I guess I'm asking your permission this morning to just be real and to just talk about this openly, because it's an important topic. It's important in virtually every area of our lives. And so in the church, in our faith, this is an important issue as well. And so I think it's important for the church as well as for us as Christians. I think this issue of stewardship and finances in particular is important at a practical level. And I think it's important at a spiritual level. And so that's what I want us to talk about this morning. I want us to talk about why money matters, why it's important, why stewardship is important to the church and to us as individuals, why it's important at a practical level, and why it's important at a spiritual level. So let's talk about the practical level. Let's start there. And to really understand the whole concept of giving in the church and stewardship and tithing and all of that, I think we really need to go back to the Old Testament to really see where this all begins. And we have to go back really to the Levites. So if you want to follow along with me, I am going to turn to a few verses in the book of Numbers, looking at chapter 18, verse 20, and then jumping to verse 24. Beginning in Numbers 18, verse 20. The Lord said to Aaron, "You will have no inheritance in the land, nor will you have any share among them. I am your share and your inheritance among the Israelites." And then skipping down to verse 24. "Instead, I give to the Levites," that are the descendants of Aaron, "I give to the Levites as their inheritance the tithe that the Israelites present as an offering to the Lord. That is why I say concerning them, they will have no inheritance among the Israelites." Now, to understand this particular verse, you need to go back to the Exodus and the Promised Land. You all, I think, pretty much know the story. The Israelites are in captivity. Moses goes to Pharaoh. He leads his people out of Egypt. Go through the, all that stuff that they went through. A long story. But finally, 40 years of wandering, the next generation is ready to enter the Promised Land. And when they enter the Promised Land, by tribe, God divides up the land, and he gives each of the tribes the land, a piece of the land, a section of the land, except for one tribe, and that one tribe being the Levites. The Levites get no inheritance. They get no land. And the reason is the Levites are the priestly tribe. They are the ones who are intended to lead worship and do the work of the church, or the community. In that case, it's the community and the church are inseparable in this regard. And so they are the priests, if you will, of the Jewish people. And so they don't get a tribe. They are dispersed among all the lands. They have cities where they populate, but they are dispersed among all the other tribes' lands. They get no land of their own. And the reason they get no land is because they are there in service to God in a special way, set apart in that way, and the way their needs are provided for. So they don't have a piece of land they go out and farm or whatever. The way their needs are provided for is the Israelites are to bring a tithe to God, basically, that is administered by the Levites, and it provides for their needs so that they can do the priesthood, so they can care for the temple, so that they can serve the sacrifices and all of that. And so really the original foundation of this concept goes all the way back to the Levites having this tithe that the nation of Israel was to bring. So all the rest of the people, and in fact the Levites themselves tithed from what they received, but the people were to bring a tithe. Now if you know what that word means, you know that means a tenth. And so the Jews were all expected to bring a tenth of their harvest, their flocks, their wine, their olive oil, whatever they were producing. They were to bring a tenth of it to the temple, to the Levites, basically, to be cared for. Now that concept continued, and then we're going to jump ahead now to the New Testament, and you see it sort of many years later, sort of evolving. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years later. It sort of evolves a little bit into more of what we now understand the offering to be, more the way we look at it. So I'm going to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. So you can follow me there if you want. You can just listen in. But from 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1. This is Paul speaking, of course. "Now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian church to do. On the first day of each week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income." So he's talking again about proportional giving. Like the tithe, it wasn't that they set a certain dollar amount, everyone gives this amount. It was to be proportionate to your income. So if your income was here, then your tithe was this much. If your income was here, then your tithe was this much. So that idea of proportional giving, saving it up so that when I come, no special collection will have to be made. You will have been each week putting in, and then he talks about going on to bring that to Jerusalem to some of those in need. And so they would use that money to help care for fellow believers, to help care for the needs of the widows and the orphans, and to do the work, basically, of the early church. So Paul, in the same way, sort of specified that they would each week set aside an offering that was a percentage of their income in order to give. Now, Paul doesn't talk so much about tithe because they actually understood the tithe to be the minimum, and that they gave above and beyond that. And so he just said in keeping with your income. And so at a practical level, stewardship was intended to be a way of providing for the work. In the early days, among the Levites, it was the work of the priesthood. As we get into the New Testament, it was the overall work of the mission of the church. But there was this idea that we set aside a portion of our income, a tithe of our income, to facilitate the work of the church. And so there was this very practical nature of the tithe, of stewardship, of giving. Now, I want to say, I believe in the work of the church. I believe that God has called us to a great work, that the church is desperately needed. The work of the church, what we are able to bring to the world, is desperately needed in our time and our culture. In fact, I'm convinced that the mission of the church is more critical today than it's ever been. I think the world desperately needs Jesus Christ, desperately needs the church to rise up and to do the work of mission and to reach out to those who are hurting and struggling and provide in practical ways and all of that. I believe in this. I think this is the greatest work any of us can be a part of. And so at a very practical level, our giving, our tithing, makes the work of God's church possible. We could not do the work of the church without the combined stewardship of every one of us. Every person matters in this work. This work is huge. It's critical. And it requires all of us. Now, today, when we talk about stewardship, we often look at it actually in three key areas. We look at it in terms of the stewardship of our time, in stewardship of our talents, and the stewardship of our resources. And I would say to you today that those three are still the key to what makes it possible for us to be in mission and ministry, what makes it possible for the Church of Jesus Christ to do the work that God has called us to. You and I are called upon to give up our time for the work of God, to steward our time. He's given us 24 hours a day. We all have the same amount of time. The question is, will we use that time well, and will we allow some of that time to be used for the work of Christ? Obviously, some of the time is going to be spent sleeping, and some of it eating, and some of it at our vocation, but we will still have time in there to pour into the things of God. And so stewardship of our time, stewardship of our talents. Each of us has given certain resources and abilities. I mean, by that I mean talents that we now invest. Some of you may be gifted musicians. Hopefully you're using those gifts in the work of the church, being in a praise team or a choir, or doing special music or something like that. You know, some of you may have skills in carpentry, and so you choose to be a part of a mission team that's going to help rebuild a home, or who knows what. Some of you have skills in cooking, and so you're going to go down to the towers in Amesbury, or help out with the food pantry or the soup kitchen and provide a meal or something. So you use that gift. So we take our time, we take our talents, and we take our resources, our financial resources, whatever it is that God has entrusted to us financially. And we share some of that back in the work of the church. Because the reality is that as much as we need money for every other aspect of life, the church requires resources, financial resources, to exist, to run, to turn on the lights, to heat the building, to have staff. All that kind of stuff happens because you and I are faithful stewards of our resources. So, at a practical level, without stewardship, the church cannot be effective in its call. We cannot do the work that God called us to. But there is also a spiritual component to stewardship. I mean, yes, the practical is important, but there's also a faith development aspect of stewardship. And because there is, the reality is that if we struck oil on church property and suddenly had more money than we ever knew, if we became the Beverly Hillbillies of the Christian church, and we struck oil in our backyard at the church, and we just, money was flowing by the billions of dollars, I would still take an offering every week. We would still need to be stewards of our resources. Even if the church's needs were supplied beyond measure, beyond imagination, we would still need stewardship. And the reason we would is because it is also a spiritual exercise. That there is also a spiritual component to stewardship. And let me tell you why. Let me tell you what I mean by that. First of all, faithful stewardship, caring well for the resources God has entrusted to us, first of all, acknowledges that everything comes from God. It's our way of saying, when we give back to the work of Christ, it's our way of saying, God, I acknowledge that everything I have has come from your generous hand. Now, I know some people might debate that, say, well, no, I worked hard for what I have. You know, I went to work every morning. I earned this. God didn't give me any of this. Well, let's think about that for a minute. You have life because God gave you life. You have strength because God gives you strength. You have the health to be able to get up every morning. You're healthy enough to get out and earn a living. You've got skills and abilities that God created you with, that God poured into you. You've got opportunities that God opened the door for, I believe. You know, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we don't have a part of that. Of course, we partner with God in all of this. God opens the door. We go through it. We apply for the job. We put on our best. You know, God opens up a job for us. We work hard at it. We pour energy. He gives us life every morning. We invest that life in the work. It is a partnership, absolutely. But when we give back to God, we are acknowledging that were it not for God's hand on our life, had he not brought us into existence, had he not poured breath into us every day, had he not given us skills and strength and energy and courage and all of that, that we could not do what we do today. And we would not have what we have today. And so the first thing, spiritually speaking, is that stewardship acknowledges to God that he has been good to us, that he has blessed us, that he's given us what we need to be able to survive and to live and to have all that we have. And so, first of all, it expresses acknowledgement to God, which really is a way of saying it thanks God. It's a way that we thank God for all that he has poured into our lives. Secondly, once we've acknowledged that all that we have has come from God's own hand, then faithful stewardship becomes obedience to God. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the reality is God has instructed us to give to the work. God has said to us, bring forth the tithe. He literally said to the Israelites, bring the tithe into my temple. You know, in Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 10, I'm not going to turn to it, just paraphrase. He basically says, oh, you Israelites, you are robbing me. And then the prophet says, you may ask, Lord, how are we robbing you? And God replies, because you're not bringing forth the full tithe. Basically, the prophet Malachi brought the message from God that was chastising the Jews because they had begun to cheat on their tithe. They weren't bringing forth the best to God. They weren't bringing forth the whole tithe. Rather than the 10% God had asked for, they were bringing forth 2% or 1% or whatever. And so, you know, God makes it pretty clear that anything short of that he considers robbing him, is the words he uses. That's a strong word. But his point is that when we give proportionately, when we tithe, it is an act of obedience to God. It is saying, God, I understand this is what you've called us to. I acknowledge that all I have is from you. And so now I want to obey your word and give back to you in the way that you have given to me. So let's talk about the tithe for a minute. I know this is one of those tough issues, and a lot of people struggle with it. And really, a tithe? Is that even possible? Nicole and I have been tithing for 30 plus years. And I will just tell you my own experience. The first few months, it's tough. It's challenging. It seems like, it's hard. It's a hard goal to reach. And it sounds like a huge thing. But I just want to say, you get used to it. It just sort of becomes the new normal. You know what I mean? It becomes the new baseline in our lives. So at first, when you first start to tithe, you first start to give proportionally and generously to the work of Christ. At first, you really feel it. But within a few months, we had just kind of normalized. We had just kind of gotten used to living at 90% instead of 100% of our income. And it just sort of became the new baseline. And here's what I liken it to. Imagine you get laid off from your job. And you're out looking around, and you're having trouble finding something. And then this job opens up, and it pays roughly 90% of what your old job did. Most of the time, particularly in an economy like this, we'd take that. We'd say, yeah, we're going to have to tighten our belt a little bit. But praise God, we got a job that paid 90% of what I used to. And within a fairly short amount of time, you get used to your level of living and spending just sort of levels off at that 90% instead of what it used to be at the 100%. And it just becomes the norm. And truthfully, you settle into it and become fairly comfortable with it within a fairly short amount of time. I found it really didn't take that long to get used to it. So at first, it seems like a big deal. It seems hard. But I want to say to you, you just settle into it. It just becomes the norm for you. And I don't find it challenging. I don't find it difficult, to be honest, to tithe. In fact, now Nicole and I are challenging ourselves to move beyond a tithe, and have for a number of years, because that sort of just became, it got to the point where it didn't even feel sacrificial anymore. It just felt like the baseline. It felt like the norm. And then sacrifice came in what we did beyond that. And so I know this tithe thing sounds challenging, but trust me, you can do it. You can do it. I believe any of us can do it and still live well. Still live in a way that God provides for our needs. And I'm not saying that we're all going to be rich and millionaires or anything like that. That's not the goal of life. I know some people think it is, but it's not. So we first of all, faithful stewardship acknowledges that it's all come from God. And because it's all come from God anyways, for us to now be obedient to God and give back to Him the tithe that He asks of us, becomes sort of a reasonable thing. And thirdly, faithful stewardship now develops trust in God. Because guess what happens? You start to tithe, and at first, it's difficult, and it's a struggle, and you worry about whether you'll still be able to pay the mortgage, and whether you'll be able to pay your bills, and whether you'll still be able to put food on the table, and what have you. But somehow, lo and behold, God provides. And so, what do we discover? We discover that even though we sacrificed, God was faithful. And so God took care of us. And so it builds our faith. It grows our trust of God, because we discovered that as we gave faithfully to God, God was faithful to us in return and took care of our needs, met our needs, helped us to continue to get through it all. I will tell you that in 30 years of tithing, we've had times when it was kind of low and we struggled along a little bit. And we've had times that were better and we felt really, like abundance. But God has never failed to take care of us. God has always cared for our needs. That has never been an issue. And so over the years, we have just learned increasingly that we can have faith and trust in God. And this is what I mean about it being a spiritual component of giving. I would want us to give generously because it builds our trust. It builds our confidence in God. It builds our faith. And so even if the church didn't need a penny from a practical perspective, from a spiritual perspective, there's still a reason to be faithful in stewardship. Now, as far as God providing for us, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting a health and wealth gospel. I'm not one of these guys who's going to say to you, hey, yeah, give this huge chunk to the church and then God's going to give you 10 times as much back. As if this was some kind of cosmic investment scheme, some kind of pyramid scheme. Yeah, that is bad theology. I'm not saying to you that health and wealth gospel, if you will just pour, sacrificially into the plate, then that means that God's going to make you a millionaire. Or God's going to have you driving a Cadillac. Or whatever. What I'm saying is that God is faithful. What I'm saying is when we are faithful to God, God is faithful to us. And He takes care of us. And He provides for us. And He makes sure that our needs are met. And so I want to make sure we draw that distinction. So, here's what I'm saying. I'm basically encouraging us, challenging us to be generous givers, to be tithers. I know that sounds like a stretch or something, but to be tithers, to give even as God called the Israelites to give even as the early church gave. I believe that for the sake of the work that God has called us to, and for the sake of our own spiritual growth, I believe God desires for us to be good stewards, to be faithful in our giving, to give generously and sacrificially. I will tell you that in my own life, I have found this to be a blessing. It started out feeling like a challenge, but honestly, it turned out to be a great blessing. It's a blessing because I believe in the work, and I'm excited about what God is doing through the resources we share and the ways that our church is making a difference in the world. But I believe in it because of the way it's helping me to grow spiritually, the way it's helping me to grow closer to God, learn all the more that I can trust Him for all things in life. So in this Thanksgiving week, my challenge to us, beginning today, is to be generous givers in the work of Christ. Would you join me in prayer?